Hello, this is Seraphim, and today I bring you a new original story on my channel about justice, hidden truths, and lives that change when karma finally arrives. The old woman lay face down on the cold marble steps of La Maison d'Or, the most expensive restaurant in downtown Atlanta. Her gray coat was soaked through from the evening rain. Her shoes had holes so wide you could see her swollen, blistered feet. A cardboard sign had fallen from her hand and landed in a puddle. It read, "Hungry, God bless." Inside the restaurant, a 23-year-old busboy named Marcus Tate was clearing champagne glasses from a table where four businessmen had just spent $9,000 on a single dinner. One of those men glanced out the window, saw the old woman on the steps, and laughed. "Somebody call animal control," he said, and the whole table erupted. Marcus did not laugh. He set down the tray. He walked toward the front door, and what happened next would change his life and the lives of everyone in that building in ways that nobody could have predicted. But let me start from the beginning. Marcus Tate woke up every morning at 4:45 in a studio apartment on the south side of Atlanta. The apartment was so small that when he stretched his arms out, his fingertips could almost touch both walls. The ceiling had a brown water stain shaped like the state of Texas, and the radiator made a clanking sound every 20 minutes like a prisoner tapping on the pipes. But Marcus kept the place clean. He kept his one good pair of shoes polished. He kept a photograph of his grandmother, Nana Ruth, taped to the mirror above the sink, and every morning he looked at that photograph and said the same words she used to say to him. "Be the kind of man that God ain't ashamed of, baby." Nana Ruth had raised him from the age of 6 after his mother disappeared into whatever darkness had swallowed her. She had fed him on a church secretary's salary, kept him in clean clothes, made sure he did his homework at the kitchen table every evening before he could touch the television remote. She had died 2 years ago, and Marcus still felt the hole she left in his chest like a missing rib. His mornings followed the same pattern, as steady and predictable as the ticking of a clock. He would shower in water that never got hotter than lukewarm, eat 2 pieces of toast with peanut butter, drink 1 cup of instant coffee that tasted like it had been brewed in a rusty can, and then he would walk 40 minutes to the restaurant because the bus fare was $2 he could not afford to spend every day. He walked past the bail bonds offices and the check cashing stores, past the liquor store where old men sat on crates arguing about baseball, past the church where Nana Ruth used to sing in the choir. He walked until the streets changed, until the cracked sidewalks became smooth, the chain-link fences became wrought iron, the corner stores became boutiques. He walked from one Atlanta to another, and the border between them was as sharp as a knife. La Maison d'Or sat on Peachtree Street like a golden crown on a king's head. The building was a restored Victorian mansion with white columns and tall windows that glowed amber in the evening light. The name was written in gold script above the entrance, and beneath it, in smaller letters, were the words, "Excellence in every detail." The restaurant had 3 Michelin stars, a wine cellar with over 4,000 bottles, and a waiting list that stretched 6 months into the future. A dinner for 2 could cost more than Marcus made in a month. The owner, a man named Vincent Calloway, had taken over the restaurant 8 years ago when the previous corporation sold off the chain. Calloway was a big man with silver hair combed straight back and a handshake that could crush walnuts. He wore custom suits, drove a black Mercedes, and believed that the world was divided into 2 kinds of people, those who paid and those who served. Marcus was, in Calloway's eyes, firmly and permanently in the second category. Marcus's job was simple. He cleared tables, polished glasses, mopped spills, carried heavy trays of dirty dishes to the kitchen, and stayed invisible. Calloway had made this very clear on Marcus's first day. "You are the background," Calloway had said, standing over Marcus with his arms crossed, the gold cufflinks on his shirt catching the light. "The guests should never notice you. They should never hear you. If they look at you, you have already failed. Do you understand?" Marcus had nodded because he needed the job. He needed the $7.75 an hour. He needed the shift meal, which was the only real meal he ate most days. And he needed to keep the lights on in that tiny apartment because if he lost it, there was nothing beneath him but the street. The other staff at La Maison d'Or treated Marcus the way furniture treats dust, with total indifference. The waiters, who earned tips that sometimes exceeded $1,000 in a single night, looked through him as if he were made of glass. The sommelier, a thin French man named Philippe, once snapped his fingers at Marcus and said, "Boy, there is a puddle of Bordeaux on table 9. It costs more than you. Clean it up." The hostess, a tall woman named Chelsea with perfect teeth and a smile she could turn on and off like a light switch, had once told a new server, in Marcus's hearing, "Don't bother learning his name. Busboys don't last." Only the head chef, a large, loud woman named Big Shirley, showed Marcus any warmth. She would set aside an extra piece of cornbread for him or slip a container of soup into his bag at the end of his shift. "You remind me of my nephew," Big Shirley told him once. "Good kid in a hard world. Keep your head up." Marcus kept his head up. He kept his mouth shut. He worked his shifts, cleared his tables, polished his glasses, and walked home in the dark. He was saving money, dollar by dollar, for community college. He wanted to study business. He wanted to build something of his own someday, something that would have made Nana Ruth proud. He kept a notebook in his back pocket where he wrote down ideas. A food truck that served her recipes, a catering company for churches, a small restaurant in the old neighborhood where people could eat good food without being made to feel small. These were dreams, and he knew that dreams were fragile things, as easy to break as a champagne glass. But he held on to them the way a man in deep water holds on to a piece of wood, because without them, he would sink. It was a Friday evening in October when everything changed. The air had turned cool, and the trees along Peachtree Street were dropping their leaves like gold coins. The restaurant was fully booked, every table filled with Atlanta's wealthiest. There was a tech millionaire celebrating a merger, a hip-hop producer with a diamond chain that could have paid off Marcus's student loans 3 times over, a table of lawyers from one of the big downtown firms, and in the private dining room, a group of investors from New York who were in town to discuss a deal worth $200 million. The energy in the restaurant was electric, and Calloway moved through the room like a shark through warm water, shaking hands, pouring compliments, making sure every glass was full and every ego was stroked. Marcus worked steadily, weaving between tables with heavy trays balanced on his shoulder. His back ached and his feet throbbed inside his worn shoes, but he kept moving, because that was what you did when you were the background. At around 8:30, he carried a tray of dirty dishes through the swinging kitchen doors and nearly collided with Philippe, who was carrying a bottle of wine that cost $4,000. Philippe stumbled, caught the bottle, and turned on Marcus with fury in his pale blue eyes. "You clumsy fool," Philippe hissed, grabbing Marcus by the collar of his white shirt. "If you had broken this bottle, you would have worked the next 2 years for free. Get out of my way." Marcus said nothing. He stepped aside. He set down the tray. His jaw was tight, but his hands were steady. He had learned a long time ago that anger was a luxury poor people could not afford. At 9:15, Big Shirley called Marcus to the kitchen window. "Your shift meal's ready, baby," she said, sliding a plate across the stainless steel counter. It was a beautiful plate. Pan-seared chicken breast with roasted vegetables and garlic mashed potatoes. The same dish that sold for $48 in the dining room. Marcus picked up the plate and carried it to the small staff break area in the back hallway, a plastic chair at a folding table next to the mop closet. He sat down, bowed his head for a moment the way Nana Ruth had taught him, and picked up his fork. He was about to take his first bite when he heard a sound from outside. It came through the thin walls and the back door that led to the alley. It was a low, weak sound, like a kitten mewing. But it wasn't a kitten. It was a human voice, and it was saying, "Please, help me, please." Marcus set down his fork. He stood up. He pushed open the back door and stepped into the alley. The rain had picked up, a cold, persistent drizzle that soaked through clothing in minutes. The alley smelled of garbage and wet cardboard. And there, on the ground next to the dumpster, lay an old woman. She was small, no more than 5 feet tall, and thin in the way that comes from not eating enough for a very long time. Her gray coat was torn at the shoulder. Her hair was white and matted against her skull. Her skin was dark, lined deeply around the eyes and mouth, and her hands were trembling as she tried to push herself up from the wet concrete. A small cloth bag sat next to her, its contents spilling out. A water bottle, a rolled-up blanket, a Bible with a cracked spine. Marcus did not hesitate. He bent down and gently placed his hand under the old woman's arm. "Ma'am, can you hear me? Are you all right?" The old woman's eyes fluttered open. They were dark brown, almost black, and despite the pain and the cold, there was something sharp in them, something alert and watching. "I'm dizzy," she whispered. "Haven't eaten since yesterday. I just need to sit down somewhere." Marcus looked at her. He looked at the rain falling on her thin body. He looked at her swollen feet and her trembling hands. And then he did something that most people in his position would not have done. He took off his jacket, the only jacket he owned, a black cotton zip-up that Nana Ruth had given him for his 21st birthday, and he wrapped it around the old woman's shoulders. Then he went back inside, picked up his plate of food, the only meal he would eat that day, and he brought it out and placed it in her hands. "Here," he said softly, "you need this more than I do." The old woman looked at the plate. She looked at the chicken and the vegetables and the mashed potatoes steaming in the cold air. Then she looked up at Marcus, and something moved across her face. It was an expression that was hard to read, something between surprise and recognition, as if she had been searching for something for a very long time and had just found it in the last place she expected. "You're giving me your dinner," she said. It was not a question. "Yes, ma'am," Marcus said. "It's good food, made by a good woman. Please eat." The old woman ate slowly, carefully, savoring each bite the way a person does when they have not tasted real food in days. Marcus crouched beside her in the rain, making sure she was steady, asking if she needed water, if she needed anything else. He did not rush her. He did not check his watch. He did not think about the dishes piling up inside or the tables that needed clearing. For those few minutes, the only thing that mattered was this old woman and her plate of food. When she was finished, she set the plate down and placed both hands on Marcus's arm. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "What is your name, son?" she asked. "Marcus, Marcus Tate." The old woman nodded slowly, as if she were filing the name away in a place where it would never be lost. "Marcus Tate," she repeated. "Your grandmother raised you, didn't she?" Marcus blinked, startled. "How did you know that?" The old woman smiled, a small, knowing smile that seemed to contain years of wisdom. "Because only a grandmother's love produces a heart like yours. I can see it. The same way I can see rain falling." Before Marcus could respond, the back door slammed open so hard it cracked against the brick wall. Vincent Calloway stood in the doorway, his face red, his silver hair disheveled, his eyes blazing with a fury that seemed to radiate heat. Behind him stood Philippe, wearing a thin, satisfied smile. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Calloway's voice was low and dangerous, the kind of low that comes before an explosion. Marcus stood up slowly. "Sir, this woman collapsed. She needed help. She needed food." Calloway looked at the old woman the way a person looks at something stuck to the bottom of their shoe. He looked at the empty plate. He looked at Marcus's jacket around her shoulders. And then something happened to his face. The controlled businessman vanished, and in his place appeared something raw and ugly. "You left your station," Calloway said, each word dropping like a stone. "You took a $48 plate of food from my kitchen, and you gave it to a vagrant." He pointed at the old woman without looking at her, as if even directing his gaze toward her was beneath him. "A filthy, homeless vagrant who is trespassing on my property." Marcus felt the heat rise in his chest, but he kept his voice level. "She's a human being, Mr. Calloway. She was hungry and she was sick. I couldn't just step over her." Calloway took one step closer, and Marcus could smell his cologne, something expensive and sharp like crushed cedar. "This is a 3-star restaurant, not a soup kitchen. Do you understand what our guests would think if they saw you out here feeding the homeless like it's a church picnic? Do you understand what that does to our brand?" He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crisp $100 bill. He held it out to the old woman without even looking at her. "Take this and leave, now, before I call the police." The old woman did not take the money. She sat perfectly still, watching Calloway with those sharp, dark eyes, watching him the way a scientist watches a specimen under a microscope. Calloway turned back to Marcus, the $100 bill crumpled in his fist. "You're done. You're fired. Get your things and get out of my restaurant." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. His jaw tightened, his hands balled into fists at his sides. He thought about the rent that was due in 12 days. He thought about the electricity bill, the instant coffee, the 40-minute walk, the notebook full of dreams in his back pocket. He thought about Nana Ruth's voice saying, "Be the kind of man that God ain't ashamed of." And so Marcus Tate did not beg. He did not argue. He did not raise his voice or throw a punch. He straightened his back, looked Calloway directly in the eye, and said, in a voice that was quiet but absolutely steady, "I would rather lose this job 100 times than step over a hungry old woman and pretend I didn't see her." The alley was silent for a long moment. The rain fell. Philippe smirked from the doorway. Calloway's face twisted into something between contempt and disbelief, the face of a man who could not comprehend that someone would choose poverty over obedience. "Then you've made your choice," Calloway said. "Get off my property, both of you." He turned on his heel and walked back inside, and the door slammed shut behind him with a finality that echoed off the brick walls like a gunshot. Philippe lingered for a moment, savoring the scene, before following his boss inside. The lock clicked. The light above the door went dark. Marcus stood in the rain. He had no jacket. He had no job. He had no dinner. He had $16 in his bank account, rent due in 12 days, and nothing between him and disaster but his own 2 feet. He looked down at the old woman, and despite everything, he smiled. "Well, ma'am, looks like we're both out in the cold tonight." The old woman reached up and took his hand. Her grip was warm despite the chill. "Sit with me for a minute, Marcus Tate," she said. "I have something I want to tell you." Marcus sat down on the wet concrete beside her, his back against the dumpster, the rain soaking through his thin white shirt. He had nowhere to be, so he listened. "This restaurant," the old woman said, gesturing toward the building with one gnarled hand. "What do you know about its history?" Marcus shrugged. "Not much. Mr. Calloway bought it from some corporation about 8 years ago. Before that, it was part of a chain, I think. La Maison d'Or. There used to be 5 of them across the South." The old woman nodded. 6, actually. Atlanta, Memphis, New Orleans, Birmingham, Charleston, and one in Houston that closed after the flood. Do you know who founded this chain? Marcus shook his head. "No, ma'am." The old woman was quiet for a moment. The rain tapped on the cardboard around them like impatient fingers. "A woman named Evelyn Grace founded it in 1978, she said. She was a cook, a black woman from Macon, Georgia, who started with a food cart on Auburn Avenue, selling fried catfish and collard greens for $2 a plate. She saved every penny. She borrowed from her church. She worked 18-hour days for 7 years. And in 1978, she opened the first La Maison d'Or in a little brick building on Edgewood Avenue." Marcus listened, drawn in despite the cold. There was something about the way the old woman spoke, a rhythm, a cadence, that reminded him powerfully of Nana Ruth telling stories at the kitchen table. "Evelyn Grace built that restaurant on 3 principles," the old woman continued. "The food must be excellent, the service must be warm, and no one, no matter how poor, how dirty, how broken, should ever be turned away hungry from its doors. She kept a pot of soup by the back door, every single night, for anyone who needed it. She called it the Grace Pot, and she put a clause in the founding charter of the company that said those 3 principles could never be abandoned, not as long as La Maison d'Or carried her name." The old woman paused and turned to look at Marcus directly. The streetlight caught her eyes, and he saw something fierce in them, something that burned. Evelyn Grace sold the chain in 2004 to a corporation called Sterling Hospitality Group. She was 70 years old, tired, ready to rest. But she was not stupid. She had her lawyers write a clause into the sale contract, a moral standards clause, Article 14, Section 3. It said that if the restaurant's management was ever found to have violated the founding principles, if they turned away the hungry, if they abandoned warmth for cruelty, if they treated human beings as less than human, Evelyn Grace, or her legal designee, had the right to invoke a controlling interest clause. A clause that would void the sale and return ownership to her. The corporation's lawyers read the clause and laughed. They thought it was sentimental nonsense. They signed it without a second thought. Marcus stared at the old woman. The rain had slowed to a mist. Somewhere in the distance, a car horn honked. "How do you know all this?" he asked. The old woman smiled. It was the same small, knowing smile she had given him before, but now it carried something else, something like power. "Because my name is Evelyn Grace," she said, "and I have been traveling this country for the last 3 years, visiting every restaurant that carries my name, dressed exactly like this, testing whether the values I built this company on still exist." Marcus's hands went numb, not from the cold, from the shock that traveled through his body like an electric current, starting in his chest and spreading to his fingers and toes. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. His mind was trying to process what he had just heard, trying to reconcile the frail old woman beside the dumpster with the founder of a restaurant empire. He looked at her cloth bag, the Bible, the water bottle, the torn coat. He looked at her swollen feet and her matted hair, and he looked at her eyes. Those sharp, dark, watchful eyes that had been taking in every single detail of what had happened tonight. The way Calloway had looked at her, the way he had held out that crumpled $100 bill, the way he had said vagrant with his lip curled, and the way Marcus had taken off his jacket and given her his only meal. "You've been testing people," Marcus said slowly. It was not a question. Evelyn Grace nodded. "I have been to Memphis. The manager there brought me a blanket and called a shelter. I have been to New Orleans. The head chef fed me gumbo in his own kitchen. I have been to Charleston. The hostess invited me inside and let me warm myself by the fireplace. But here," she paused and her voice hardened, "here, in the first restaurant I ever built, in the city where I started with nothing but a food cart and a dream, the owner looked at me like I was garbage. He tried to buy me off with $100. He fired the only person in his entire staff who showed me basic human kindness. And he did it without a shred of shame." Her hand tightened on Marcus's arm. "I saw everything, Marcus. I saw how he treated you. I saw how that wine man looked at you. I saw how they all looked through you. And I saw what you did anyway." Marcus sat in stunned silence. His shirt was soaked through and clinging to his skin. His teeth were starting to chatter. But something warm was spreading through him, something that had nothing to do with temperature. It was the feeling of being seen, truly seen. Not as a busboy, not as the background, not as something to step over or look through, but as a man, a good man, the kind of man his grandmother had raised him to be. "What are you going to do?" he asked quietly. Evelyn Grace reached into her cloth bag and pulled out something that Marcus had not noticed before. It was a small leather folder tucked between the Bible and the water bottle. She opened it and took out a business card. It was cream-colored, heavy stock, with gold lettering. It read, "Evelyn Grace, founder, La Maison d'Or." Below the name was a phone number and the words, "Article 14, Section 3. "Not tonight," Evelyn Grace said, slipping the card back into the folder. "Tonight, I am just a tired old woman who was fed by a kind young man. But soon, Marcus, very soon, I am going to remind Vincent Calloway and everyone like him that cruelty has consequences. And that kindness, real kindness, the kind that costs you something, is the most powerful force in this world." She patted his arm and then, with surprising strength, pushed herself to her feet. She adjusted the jacket he had given her around her shoulders. "Keep that notebook in your back pocket," she said, and Marcus's eyes went wide because he had never mentioned the notebook. "The dreams you write in there are going to come true, but not the way you think." She began to walk down the alley, her small frame disappearing into the mist. Marcus called after her. "Mrs. Grace, wait! Your card, the phone number, how do I reach you?" She turned back, and even in the dim light, he could see her smile. "You don't reach me, Marcus. I reach you. And I will. I always keep my promises." Then she was gone, swallowed by the rain and the night, as if she had never been there at all. Marcus sat alone in the alley for a long time. The rain stopped, the sounds of the restaurant, the clinking glasses, the murmur of wealthy voices drifted through the walls like sounds from another world. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out his notebook. It was damp but intact. He opened it to a blank page and wrote 3 words, "She saw me." The days that followed were the hardest of Marcus's life. He woke up the next morning with a cold that settled deep in his chest, a wet cough that rattled like stones in a tin can. He had no jacket. He had no job. He had $16. The rent was due in 11 days, and the amount, $550, might as well have been $5 million. He spent the first day applying for jobs, walking from restaurant to restaurant along Peachtree Street and beyond, filling out applications, asking to speak to managers. At every place, they asked the same question. "Where did you work last?" And when he said La Maison d'Or, their eyebrows went up. "Why did you leave?" He told the truth. He told them he was fired for helping a homeless woman. Some of them looked at him with pity, some with skepticism. None of them called him back. On the 3rd day, Marcus swallowed his pride and went to a temporary staffing agency near 5 Points. The office smelled of stale coffee and carpet cleaner. A woman behind the counter with long acrylic nails typed his information into a computer and told him they had an opening for a night janitor at a warehouse in Decatur. $7 an hour, midnight to 6. Marcus took it. He walked home, set his alarm for 11, and tried to sleep in the afternoon light that poured through his one window like an accusation. He could not sleep. He stared at the water stain on the ceiling and thought about Nana Ruth. He thought about what she would say if she could see him now. "Baby, trouble don't last always, but weak people don't last either. You decide which one you're gonna be." He closed his eyes and breathed deeply, and when the alarm went off at 11, he got up and walked to Decatur in the dark. The warehouse was enormous and cold, filled with rows of metal shelving stacked with boxes. Marcus mopped concrete floors, cleaned bathrooms, emptied trash cans the size of bathtubs. His cough worsened. His back screamed. But he worked through the night, and when the sun came up, he walked home with $35 earned and subtracted it from what he owed. The math was brutal. Even working every night for 2 weeks, he would fall short of the rent by nearly $200. He called his landlord, a tired-sounding man named Mr. Patterson, and explained the situation. Mr. Patterson listened in silence, then said, "Marcus, you've been a good tenant. I'll give you 10 extra days, but after that, I can't help you." Marcus thanked him and hung up the phone. He sat on the edge of his bed, elbows on his knees, head in his hands. The photograph of Nana Ruth watched him from the mirror. He could almost hear her voice. "Get up, baby. You ain't done yet." A week passed. Marcus worked the night janitor shift and spent his days looking for a second job. He ate what he could afford, which was mostly rice and canned beans. He lost weight. The cough stayed. He kept writing in his notebook, though the dreams felt further away than ever, like stars seen through clouds. He thought about Evelyn Grace sometimes, wondered if he had imagined the whole thing, if the cold and the hunger had caused him to hallucinate a fairy godmother in a torn gray coat. He had no proof it had happened, no business card, no phone number, nothing but the memory of her sharp, dark eyes and the words she had spoken. Kindness, real kindness, the kind that costs you something, is the most powerful force in this world. He wanted to believe it. But belief was hard when your stomach was empty and the walls were closing in. On the 10th day, something happened. Marcus was walking home from the warehouse at dawn, his feet dragging, his eyes half shut, when his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and looked at the screen. It was a text message from an unknown number. It said, "Marcus Tate, Wednesday, 10 a.m., the Georgian Terrace Hotel, room 1412. Wear something clean, bring your notebook." His hands trembled as he read the message twice, 3 times. He tried to call the number back, but it went straight to a recorded message that said, "This number does not accept incoming calls." He stood on the sidewalk as the sun climbed over the Atlanta skyline, his heart pounding in his throat, and something that he had almost given up on began to stir in his chest. Hope. Small and fragile, like a match struck in a dark room, but real. Marcus did not own a suit. He did not own a tie. He owned 2 pairs of jeans, 3 white shirts from his busboy days, and a pair of dress shoes that Nana Ruth had bought him for her own funeral, though neither of them had known that at the time. He washed the best of the white shirts by hand in the sink, ironed it with the old iron that took 10 minutes to heat up, polished the shoes until they shone, and put on the cleanest pair of jeans he had. He looked at himself in the mirror. He looked tired and thin and young, but his eyes were clear and his back was straight. He put the notebook in his back pocket, said his morning words to Nana Ruth's photograph, and walked out the door. The Georgian Terrace Hotel was a grand old building on Peachtree Street, all marble and brass and crystal chandeliers, the kind of place that made Marcus feel the distance between his world and theirs with every step across the polished lobby floor. A concierge in a gray suit looked at him the way security guards always looked at young black men in expensive places, with polite suspicion and a hand ready to reach for the phone. But Marcus walked past him with quiet confidence, stepped into the elevator, and pressed the button for the 14th floor. The hallway was silent and carpeted in deep burgundy. Room 1412 was at the end of the hall. Marcus stood before the door, took a breath that filled his lungs completely, and knocked. The door opened and Evelyn Grace stood before him, but she was transformed. Gone were the torn coat, the matted hair, the swollen feet. In their place stood a small, elegant woman in a navy blue suit, her white hair pulled back in a neat bun, gold earrings catching the light from the window behind her. She wore reading glasses perched on the end of her nose, and behind her, at a large mahogany desk, sat 2 people, a tall, serious-looking black man in a charcoal suit, and a younger white woman with a laptop open in front of her. The room was a suite, spacious and sunlit, with flowers on the table and a view of the Atlanta skyline that stretched all the way to Stone Mountain. "Come in, Marcus," Evelyn Grace said warmly, and her voice, stripped of the weakness and the trembling, was strong and musical, the voice of a woman accustomed to being heard. "Sit down. We have a lot to talk about." Marcus entered the room on legs that felt both heavy and weightless at the same time. He sat in the chair she indicated, across from the 2 strangers. Evelyn Grace sat beside him, not across from him, and that small gesture, the act of sitting on his side, told him everything he needed to know about what was happening. "Marcus, this is Gerald Thompson, my attorney, and this is Diana Chen, my business manager." The tall man nodded. The young woman smiled. Marcus shook both their hands, grateful that his own had stopped trembling. "I'm going to explain something to you," Evelyn Grace said, folding her hands in her lap. "And then I'm going to ask you a question, and your answer will determine what happens next. Not just for you, but for a great many people." Marcus nodded, his mouth dry. 19 years ago, I sold the La Maison d'Or chain to Sterling Hospitality Group for $42 million, Evelyn Grace began. "I was tired. My husband had passed. My daughter had moved to London. I wanted to rest. But I was not foolish. I had my lawyers, Gerald here being one of them, write a clause into the sale contract. Article 14, Section 3, the Moral Standards Clause." She leaned forward. "That clause states that if any La Maison d'Or restaurant is found to be operating in violation of the company's founding principles, if it turns away the hungry, if it treats human beings with cruelty or contempt, if it abandons the spirit of warmth and generosity that the company was built on, I have the right to invoke a controlling interest clause. That clause voids the current ownership's operational authority and returns controlling interest to me or to my designated successor." Gerald Thompson opened a leather briefcase and placed a thick document on the table. It was bound in blue with the La Maison d'Or logo embossed in gold on the cover. "The original sale contract," Gerald said, his voice deep and precise. "Article 14, Section 3 is on page 47. Sterling Hospitality's lawyers reviewed this document before signing. They considered the Moral Standards Clause to be, and I quote, decorative language with no legal teeth. They were wrong." Diana Chen turned her laptop screen toward Marcus. On it was a spreadsheet, rows and columns of numbers that stretched beyond what he could see. "Mrs. Grace had cameras," Diana said. "Not inside the restaurant, but on her person. A body camera disguised as a button on her coat. Standard practice for her inspections over the last 3 years. We have high-definition video of everything that happened that night. Mr. Calloway's words, his actions, his refusal to assist a person in medical distress, his termination of an employee for rendering aid, and your response." Marcus felt the room tilt slightly. He gripped the arms of the chair. The cold night in the alley, the rain, the $100 bill crumpled in Calloway's fist, the words, "filthy, homeless vagrant," the door slamming shut, the lock clicking, the light going dark. All of it had been recorded. All of it was evidence. Evelyn Grace placed her hand on his arm, the same gesture from that night, and her grip was the same, warm and firm. "I have invoked Article 14, Section 3, she said simply. "As of 9 o'clock this morning, the controlling interest in the Atlanta location of La Maison d'Or has reverted to me. Vincent Calloway's authority has been suspended pending a full operational review. His access to the building, the accounts, and the staff has been terminated." The words landed one by one, like stones dropping into still water, each one sending ripples outward. Marcus's vision blurred, and he realized his eyes were wet. He wiped them quickly with the back of his hand. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. Evelyn Grace smiled. "Because of the question I mentioned, the question that will determine what happens next." She paused, and in the silence, Marcus could hear the traffic far below and the ticking of a clock on the mantel. "I am 83 years old, Marcus. I cannot run this restaurant. I don't want to, but I need someone who can. Someone who understands what this place was supposed to be. Someone who believes that a restaurant is not just a business but a home. A place where people are fed, in every sense of the word. Someone who would give away their only meal to a stranger and lose their job without blinking, and then get up the next morning and keep going." Marcus stared at her. His brain was trying to process her words, trying to arrange them into something that made sense, but they kept rearranging themselves, like puzzle pieces that formed an impossible picture. "Mrs. Grace, I'm a busboy," he said, his voice cracking. "I was a busboy. I don't have a degree. I don't have experience in management. I don't have anything." Evelyn Grace leaned forward, and her eyes burned with that same fierce light he had seen in the alley. "You have the only thing that matters, Marcus. You have character. Everything else can be learned. Character cannot. I've been doing this for 3 years. I've visited every restaurant in the chain. I've met hundreds of people, managers, chefs, waiters, owners. And do you know how many of them gave their only meal to a homeless woman and then lost their job without a single word of anger?" She held up one finger. "One, you." Gerald Thompson cleared his throat. "Mrs. Grace is proposing to appoint you as the interim general manager of the Atlanta La Maison d'Or location, with a comprehensive training program, a management team to support you, and a clear path to permanent ownership within 5 years, contingent on performance." He slid a second document across the table. "The terms are here: salary, benefits, housing allowance, education fund. Mrs. Grace has also arranged for your enrollment in the hospitality management program at Georgia State University, fully funded." Marcus could not speak. He looked at the document. He looked at Evelyn Grace. He looked at the photograph of the Atlanta skyline through the window. The city where he had walked 40 minutes to a job that paid $7.75 an hour. The city where he had been invisible. His hands were shaking, not from cold this time, but from something much deeper, something seismic. He pressed his palms flat on the table to steady them. "Mrs. Grace," he said, and his voice was thick but controlled. "I don't know what to say." "Say yes," Evelyn Grace replied, "and then let's go to work." But the story of Marcus Tate and La Maison d'Or was far from over. Because Vincent Calloway was not the kind of man who surrendered quietly. He was the kind of man who, when backed into a corner, came out swinging. And what happened next would test Marcus in ways he never imagined, would push him to the edge of everything he believed, and would reveal secrets buried so deep that even Evelyn Grace did not know they existed. The news that Calloway had been removed from La Maison d'Or spread through Atlanta's restaurant world like fire through dry grass. By Thursday morning, every food writer, gossip columnist, and social media influencer in the city was buzzing about it. The details were murky. There was talk of a hostile takeover, a breach of contract, a mysterious clause that nobody had ever heard of. But the one thing everyone agreed on was that Vincent Calloway had been replaced by a 23-year-old busboy. The reaction ranged from shock to amusement to outrage. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution ran a story with the headline, "From Busboy to Boss, the unlikely new face of Atlanta's most exclusive restaurant." The comment section was a battlefield. Some people called it a fairy tale, others called it a joke, and a very few, called it justice. Marcus arrived at La Maison d'Or on Friday morning at 7 o'clock, wearing a new suit that Diana Chen had helped him pick out, a navy blue one that fit him better than anything he had ever worn. He stood on the sidewalk for a full minute, looking up at the gold letters above the door. The last time he had been here, he was walking out in the rain without a jacket or a job. Now he was walking in through the front door with the keys in his pocket. The irony was not lost on him. He unlocked the door, stepped inside, and breathed in the familiar sense of polished wood, fresh flowers, and the faintest hint of last night's wine. The restaurant was empty and silent, and in the morning light that poured through the tall windows, it looked like a cathedral. He walked through the dining room, trailing his fingers along the white tablecloths. He walked past the bar, where bottles of wine worth more than his old apartment glowed like jewels on the shelves. He walked into the kitchen, where the stainless steel surfaces reflected his face back at him, distorted and strange. And he walked to the back hallway, to the spot where a plastic chair and a folding table had been his dining room for nearly 2 years. He stood there for a moment. Then he picked up the plastic chair, carried it to the dumpster, and threw it away. "No more eating in the mop closet," he said to the empty room. Not for anyone, never again. At 8 o'clock, the staff began to arrive. They came in 2s and 3s, their faces guarded and uncertain, exchanging whispered conversations that stopped the moment they saw Marcus. He recognized all of them. The waiters who had looked through him. The hostess, Chelsea, with her switchable smile. Philippe, the sommelier, who had grabbed him by the collar and called him a clumsy fool. And Big Shirley, who came through the kitchen door and stopped dead when she saw him standing there in his new suit. For a long moment, nobody moved. The tension in the room was thick enough to taste, metallic and sharp, like the air before a thunderstorm. Marcus looked at them, and they looked at him, and the distance between who he had been and who he now was hung between them like a bridge that nobody was sure would hold. Marcus spoke first. His voice was calm and steady, the voice of a man who had practiced these words in the mirror at 4 in the morning. "I know this is strange. I know you're looking at me and thinking, he was clearing tables last week. And you're right, I was. But I'm here now, and I'm here because Mrs. Evelyn Grace, the woman who founded this restaurant, asked me to be. I'm not here to punish anyone. I'm not here to fire anyone. I'm here to bring this place back to what it was supposed to be. A place where the food is excellent, the service is warm, and nobody is treated as less than human." He paused. The room was absolutely silent. "I'm going to need your help, every single one of you. And if you're willing to give it, we're going to build something worth being proud of." Big Shirley broke the silence. She walked straight up to Marcus, wrapped her enormous arms around him, and squeezed so hard his feet left the floor. "Baby," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "I always knew you were meant for more than bussing tables." The room exhaled. A few people laughed nervously. A couple of the younger waiters clapped. Chelsea's smile flickered on, and this time, for maybe the first time, it looked real. But Philippe stood apart, his arms crossed, his face a mask of contempt that he made no effort to hide. He met Marcus's eyes, held the gaze for 3 long seconds, and then turned and walked out the door without a word. The door swung shut behind him, and the sound echoed through the dining room like a period at the end of a sentence. Marcus watched him go. He said nothing. He simply turned back to the staff and said, "All right, let's get to work." The first week was brutal. Marcus was learning on the job, every day a crash course in operations, inventory, scheduling, vendor management, health codes, labor law, and the 1,000 small decisions that keep a restaurant alive. Evelyn Grace had provided him with a support team. Diana Chen handled the finances. A consultant named Robert Howard guided the daily operations, and Gerald Thompson was always a phone call away for legal questions. But the weight of leadership fell on Marcus's shoulders, and there were moments, late at night when the restaurant was empty and he was going over the books by lamplight, when that weight felt like it might crush him. The staff was split. About half of them, Big Shirley and her kitchen crew, the younger waiters, the dishwashers, the bussers who had replaced him, embraced Marcus with a warmth that surprised him. They had been treated poorly under Calloway too, worked overtime without pay, berated for small mistakes, reminded daily that they were replaceable. Marcus's first act had been to raise the hourly wage for all support staff by $2, and his second had been to convert the mop closet break area into a real staff lounge with a table, chairs, a microwave, and a small refrigerator. These were small things, but small things mattered. They mattered the way a glass of water matters to someone who has been crawling through a desert. The other half of the staff, mostly the senior waiters and the front-of-house team who had thrived under Calloway's system, regarded Marcus with suspicion at best and hostility at worst. They had made good money under the old regime. Tips at La Maison d'Or were legendary, and the senior waiters guarded their territories, their tables, their regulars, with the ferocity of lions guarding their kill. Marcus's talk of warmth and generosity was, to them, the naive rambling of a boy who did not understand the business. They performed their duties competently but coolly, and Marcus could feel their resistance like a current flowing against him in deep water. And then there was Calloway. Marcus had assumed, naively, that Calloway would accept his removal and move on. A man of his wealth and connections would have options, other restaurants, other investments, other kingdoms to rule. But Marcus did not yet understand the kind of man Calloway was. Calloway was not simply a businessman who had lost a property. He was a narcissist who had been humiliated, and to a narcissist, humiliation is not an injury, but an act of war. 2 weeks after Marcus took over, the first attack came. Marcus arrived at the restaurant on a Monday morning to find a notice taped to the front door. It was a cease and desist letter from a law firm called Hartley, Drake & Whitmore, one of the most feared litigation firms in the Southeast. The letter stated that the invocation of Article 14, Section 3 was unlawful, that the Moral Standards Clause was unenforceable, and that Evelyn Grace's actions constituted tortious interference with contractual relations. It demanded that Marcus vacate the premises within 72 hours or face immediate legal action. Marcus stood on the sidewalk, reading the letter twice, 3 times, his breakfast turning to acid in his stomach. He called Gerald Thompson. Gerald's voice was calm, almost amused. "I've been expecting this. Calloway hired Hartley Drake about 3 days after the invocation. They're good lawyers, expensive and aggressive. But they have a problem." He paused. "The contract is airtight. I wrote it myself. And I spent 2 years making sure that Article 14, Section 3 could withstand exactly this kind of challenge. Calloway's lawyers are going to file a motion, and we're going to respond, and a judge is going to read the clause and the evidence, and that's going to be the end of it. Don't worry about the letter, Marcus. Worry about running the restaurant." Marcus took a breath. He crumpled the letter, stuffed it in his pocket, and unlocked the front door. But the legal attack was only the beginning. 3 days later, a health inspector appeared, unannounced, at 11 in the morning. He was a thin man with a clipboard and glasses that sat crookedly on his nose, and he went through the kitchen with a thoroughness that bordered on hostility. He checked the temperatures of every refrigerator. He swabbed surfaces. He looked behind equipment and under counters. He spent 45 minutes in the walk-in cooler. Big Shirley stood in the kitchen doorway with her arms crossed, her face a thundercloud. "This is Calloway," she muttered to Marcus. "He's got friends at the health department, I guarantee it." The inspector found 2 minor violations, a hand-washing sign that had fallen off the wall in the staff bathroom, and a container of cream that was 1 degree above the acceptable temperature, and wrote them up with a gravity usually reserved for crimes against humanity. Marcus fixed both issues within the hour, signed the paperwork, and kept his composure. But when the inspector left, he went to his office, closed the door, and sat with his head in his hands for 10 full minutes. The attacks continued. A food critic from a prominent Atlanta blog published a scathing review of the restaurant 2 weeks after Marcus took over, calling the service disorganized, the atmosphere confused, and the new management woefully inexperienced. Marcus read the review sitting at his desk at midnight, the blue light of the computer screen the only illumination in the dark office. The words stung like wasps. He read the review 3 times, looking for the truth in it, trying to separate legitimate criticism from malice. Some of it was fair. He was inexperienced. The transition had been messy. But the timing of the review, and the fact that the critic had been a regular guest of Calloway's private wine dinners, suggested something beyond journalism. Marcus closed the laptop and stared at the dark ceiling. Nana Ruth's voice came to him, faint but clear. "Baby, they gonna throw rocks at you. That's what people do when you're climbing higher than them. You just keep climbing." He kept climbing. He worked 16-hour days. He learned the wine list from a new sommelier named Grace Okafor, a young Nigerian woman with a degree in oenology and a smile that could light up a room. He studied the finances with Diana Chen until the numbers made sense. He sat with Big Shirley and rebuilt the menu, adding dishes inspired by Evelyn Grace's original food cart recipes: catfish, collard greens, sweet potato pie, peach cobbler. He reinstated the Grace pot, a large pot of soup that sat by the back door every evening, free for anyone who needed it, just as it had been in 1978. And he changed the staff meal policy. Every employee, from the head chef to the newest dishwasher, ate together at a large table in the dining room before service, eating the same food, sitting in the same chairs, using the same plates as the guests. "We are not the background," Marcus told them. "We are the heart of this place." The changes were slow to take effect, but steady, like a river reshaping a landscape. Regulars noticed the warmth that had returned to the service, the genuine smiles, the way servers remembered names and preferences, not because it was policy, but because they cared. New guests came, drawn by the story of the busboy who had become the boss, and they stayed because the food was extraordinary and the atmosphere felt like something rare, a place where wealth and warmth coexisted without contradiction. The numbers began to climb. Revenue increased by 18% in the first month. The online reviews shifted from skepticism to curiosity to outright praise. A food writer for a national magazine visited on a Saturday night and wrote, "La Maison d'Or has been reborn. The food is stunning, the service is unlike anything I've experienced, and the story behind it may be the most inspiring in American dining." But just when Marcus began to believe that the worst was behind him, the real storm arrived. It came on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks after the glowing magazine article. Marcus was in his office, going over the week's reservations, when his phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, a New York area code. He answered. "Mr. Tate?" The voice was male, deep, and carried the clipped precision of a man accustomed to delivering unpleasant news. "My name is William Drake. I'm a senior partner at Hartley, Drake, and Whitmore. I represent Vincent Calloway." Marcus's grip tightened on the phone. "I'm aware of who you represent, Mr. Drake." Drake continued as if Marcus had not spoken. "I'm calling to inform you that Mr. Calloway has filed a lawsuit in Fulton County Superior Court. The suit names you personally, Mrs. Evelyn Grace, and Gerald Thompson as defendants. The claims include fraudulent misrepresentation, constructive theft of intellectual property, and breach of fiduciary duty. The damages sought total $47 million. The number hit Marcus like a fist to the chest. $47 million. He could not have spoken if he tried. His voice was locked somewhere deep in his ribcage, pinned beneath the weight of that number. Drake was still talking, his voice smooth and relentless, but Marcus heard only fragments. Discovery phase, deposition, injunctive relief. The words blurred together into a high-pitched hum, like the ringing in his ears on the night Calloway had fired him. He managed to say, "I'll have my attorney contact you," and hung up the phone with fingers that felt disconnected from his body. He sat in the silence of his office. The clock on the wall ticked. The hum of the refrigeration units in the kitchen vibrated through the floor. $47 million. The number was absurd, laughable, a fiction. But the lawsuit was real. The threat was real. And Marcus knew, with a clarity that settled into his bones like cold water, that Calloway was not trying to win in court. He was trying to win by pressure, by exhaustion, by making the fight so expensive and so draining that Marcus would crack, that Evelyn Grace, at 83 years old, would decide it was not worth the stress, that the whole beautiful, fragile thing they were building would collapse under the weight of legal fees and sleepless nights. Marcus called Gerald Thompson. Gerald answered on the first ring, which told Marcus that he already knew. "I got a call from Drake," Gerald said. "The suit was filed this morning. I've read it. It's aggressive, but fundamentally weak. The fraudulent misrepresentation claim is baseless. The intellectual property claim is creative nonsense. The breach of fiduciary duty claim might have legs in a different context, but not this one. Calloway is burning money to burn you. His strategy is attrition." Marcus rubbed his eyes. "How long will this take?" Gerald was quiet for a moment. "Best case, 6 months. Worst case, 2 years. During that time, every financial decision you make, every hire, every expenditure will be scrutinized by Calloway's legal team. They'll depose you, me, Evelyn, the staff. They'll subpoena records. They'll look for any crack in the wall. Marcus, I need to be honest with you. This is going to be the hardest thing you've ever done." Marcus hung up the phone and sat in the dark office for a long time. He thought about quitting. The thought came unbidden, like a dark shape surfacing from deep water, and he let it sit there for a moment, let himself feel its weight. He could walk away. He could go back to the night janitor job, the studio apartment, the canned beans. He could put the notebook away and stop dreaming. It would be easier. It would be safer. It would be the choice that most people would make, and nobody would blame him for it. But then he thought about Nana Ruth. He thought about the morning she told him she was sick, the cancer already stage 4 by the time they found it. He remembered how she had sat at the kitchen table, the same table where he did his homework, and said, "Marcus, I'm not afraid of dying. I'm afraid of you not becoming who you're supposed to be." And he thought about Evelyn Grace, 83 years old, traveling the country in a torn coat, sleeping on the streets, getting rained on and looked through and stepped over, all because she believed that kindness mattered, that character mattered, that the values you built something on were worth protecting, even when protecting them cost you everything. Marcus stood up. He straightened his tie. He walked out of his office and into the kitchen, where Big Shirley was preparing the evening specials. She looked at him, read his face the way a sailor reads weather, and her own face softened. "Bad news?" she asked. "The worst," Marcus said. "Calloway is suing us for $47 million. Big Shirley set down her knife. She wiped her hands on her apron. She walked around the prep counter and placed both hands on Marcus's shoulders, and she looked into his eyes with a directness that reminded him so powerfully of Nana Ruth that his throat closed. "Baby, listen to me. I've been in kitchens for 35 years. I've seen restaurants open and close, owners come and go, lawsuits and bankruptcies and fires. And I'm going to tell you something that every good cook knows. You don't stop stirring the pot when the heat goes up. That's exactly when you stir harder." She squeezed his shoulders. "Now get out of my kitchen and go run this restaurant." The weeks that followed were a war of attrition, just as Gerald had predicted. Calloway's lawyers filed motion after motion, requests for documents, requests for depositions, requests for injunctions. Each one required a response. Each response required time and money, and the legal bills piled up like snow in a blizzard. Marcus spent his mornings at the restaurant, his afternoons in Gerald's office poring over documents, and his evenings back at the restaurant for dinner service. He slept 4 hours a night. He lost more weight. The cough that he thought had gone away came back, sharp and persistent, like an unwelcome guest who kept returning. But the restaurant thrived. Against all odds, against the lawsuit and the pressure and the whisper campaign that Calloway was waging through his network of wealthy friends, La Maison d'Or was busier than it had been in years. The story of the busboy and the homeless woman had taken on a life of its own, spreading through social media and news outlets and church congregations and barbershops and beauty salons across Atlanta and beyond. People came because they wanted to see for themselves. They came because they wanted to eat Big Shirley's catfish. They came because they wanted to sit in a restaurant where the staff smiled because they meant it. And they came because, in a world that so often rewarded cruelty and punished kindness, the story of Marcus Tate was proof that sometimes, just sometimes, the universe got it right. Then Calloway made his biggest mistake. It was a Thursday evening, 6 weeks into the lawsuit. Marcus was in the dining room, greeting guests, adjusting table settings, checking on servers, doing the 1,000 small things that make a dinner service run smoothly. The restaurant was packed, every table filled. There was a happy energy in the room, the clink of glasses, the murmur of conversation, the warm glow of candlelight on polished wood. And then the front door opened and Vincent Calloway walked in. He was not alone. Behind him was a woman Marcus did not recognize, a tall, striking woman in her 50s with sharp cheekbones and a cold, appraising gaze. And behind her was a camera crew, 2 men with professional cameras, a woman with a boom microphone, and a man with a clipboard who appeared to be a producer. They set up in the foyer with the efficiency of people who had done this many times before. Calloway stood in the center of the group, his silver hair immaculate, his suit perfectly tailored, his expression one of wounded dignity. The tall woman raised a microphone. "Mr. Calloway, can you describe for our viewers what has been done to you?" The dining room fell silent. Forks stopped moving. Conversations died. Every pair of eyes in the room turned toward the entrance, where Calloway was performing his role with the skill of a man who had been rehearsing it for weeks. "This restaurant was stolen from me," Calloway said, his voice trembling with manufactured emotion. "I built this place into what it is today. I poured my life into it. And an elderly woman with a grudge and a young man with no qualifications conspired to take it from me, using a clause that no reasonable court would uphold." He paused, let the camera linger on his face, and then delivered his line. "I am the victim here, and I want the people of Atlanta to know it." Marcus stood in the dining room watching. His hands were steady, his breathing was even. He felt a strange calm settle over him, the calm that comes when the thing you have been dreading finally arrives and turns out to be exactly what you expected. He did not move toward Calloway. He did not raise his voice. He simply stood and waited. And then, from the kitchen, Big Shirley emerged. She was not alone. Behind her came Grace Okafor, the new sommelier. Behind Grace came 2 of the younger waiters. Behind them came the dishwashers, the prep cooks, the bussers. They filed out of the kitchen one by one and stood in a line behind Marcus, a wall of people in white uniforms and black aprons, their faces set, their backs straight, their presence filling the space with a quiet, unmistakable solidarity. The tall woman with the microphone turned to Marcus. "Sir, would you like to respond?" Marcus looked at the camera. He looked at Calloway. He looked at the room full of guests, their faces tense and expectant. And he spoke in the same quiet, steady voice that he had used in the alley on the night everything started. "Mr. Calloway, you said you built this restaurant. But the woman who actually built it, who started it with a food cart and a dream, came to your door hungry and sick. And you called her a filthy vagrant, threw money at her, and told her to leave. You fired me for giving her my dinner. That's not a man who built something. That's a man who bought something and forgot what it was worth." The room was absolutely still. The camera operators glanced at each other. The producer lowered his clipboard. Calloway's face shifted, the mask of wounded dignity slipping just enough to show the fury underneath. His jaw tightened. A vein pulsed at his temple. "You don't know what you're talking about, boy," he said, and the word boy landed in the room like a slap, its meaning unmistakable, its intent clear. Several guests inhaled sharply. A woman at a nearby table covered her mouth with her hand. The tall reporter's eyes widened slightly, the instinct of a journalist recognizing the moment a story takes a turn. Marcus did not flinch. He did not blink. He looked at Calloway with eyes that held no anger and no fear, only a clarity that was almost painful to witness. "My name is Marcus Tate," he said, "and I am exactly where I belong." Behind him, Big Shirley began to clap. It was slow at first, a single pair of broad hands meeting in the silence. Then Grace joined in, then the waiters, then the bussers, and then, one by one, the guests began to clap too, a rising wave of sound that filled the dining room and spilled out through the open door into the night. Calloway stood in the center of it, his face a battlefield of emotions, rage and humiliation and something else, something that looked very much like the dawning realization that he had miscalculated badly. He turned to the camera crew. "Turn that off," he said. "Turn it off now." But the cameras were still rolling, and the tall reporter was smiling. Calloway stormed out into the night, the camera crew trailing behind him like jackals following a wounded lion. The front door swung shut. The dining room erupted in conversation, voices tumbling over each other, the electric buzz of people who had just witnessed something extraordinary. Marcus stood very still, his heart hammering, the adrenaline draining from his body and leaving him hollow and trembling. Big Shirley put her arm around him. "You did good, baby," she whispered. "You did real good." He nodded, not trusting his voice, and walked to his office on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. He closed the door. He sat down. He put his head on the desk and wept. Not from sadness, not from fear. From the sheer overwhelming force of the moment, the convergence of everything he had been through, the alley, the rain, the $16, the warehouse, the lawsuit, the sleepless nights, all of it crashing against him at once like a wave against a seawall. He wept for 5 minutes, and then he stopped. He wiped his face. He pulled out his notebook and wrote, "They came with cameras. I came with the truth. The truth was louder." The video went viral. Not the version Calloway intended. Someone in the dining room had recorded the entire confrontation on their phone, from Calloway's entrance to Marcus's response to the standing ovation. The video was posted to social media that night, and within 12 hours had been viewed over 2 million times. The comments were overwhelmingly in Marcus's favor. "This man is everything. Give him every award." Calloway called him boy. In 2026. On camera. "Wrap it up, sir. I'm booking a table at La Maison d'Or tonight. This is the kind of place I want to support." By the end of the week, the video had been covered by national news outlets, and the restaurant's reservation list had grown from 2 months to 6. But the video did something else, something that Marcus did not expect. It brought people out of the woodwork. Former employees of La Maison d'Or, people who had worked under Calloway for years and left, began to speak. They posted their stories on social media, sent emails to news outlets, and called Gerald Thompson's office. The stories were remarkably similar. Calloway had underpaid staff for years, routing the difference into a personal account. He had created a culture of fear and silence, threatening employees with termination and blacklisting if they spoke up. He had forced servers to work double shifts without overtime pay. He had pocketed tips that were meant for the support staff. And he had, on more than one occasion, made comments about employees that were racist, sexist, and demeaning. Comments that the staff had endured in silence because they needed their jobs. The most damaging testimony came from a woman named Patricia Odom, who had been the restaurant's bookkeeper for 3 years before quitting. Patricia came to Gerald Thompson's office on a Wednesday afternoon, carrying a flash drive and a look of fierce determination. "I kept copies," she said, sitting in the leather chair across from Gerald's desk. "Every doctored payroll record, every redirected tip, every fabricated expense report. I kept copies of everything because I knew that someday someone would need them." She placed the flash drive on the desk. "There are 3 years of records on that drive. Mr. Calloway stole over $400,000 from his employees, and I can prove every cent." Gerald Thompson looked at the flash drive, then at Patricia, then at Marcus, who was sitting in the corner of the office, his notebook open on his knee. "Marcus," Gerald said, and his voice held something Marcus had not heard before. A quiet, controlled excitement, the sound of a chess player who has just seen the winning move 12 turns before his opponent. "I think it's time we stopped playing defense." Marcus looked at the flash drive. It was small, black, unremarkable, the kind of object you might lose between the cushions of a couch. But what it contained was a bomb. A bomb that could destroy Vincent Calloway. But Marcus hesitated. He sat in the silence of the office, the flash drive gleaming on the desk like a dark eye, and he thought about what Nana Ruth would say. He thought about the difference between justice and revenge, between exposing the truth and destroying a man. He thought about Calloway's face in the dining room, the rage and the humiliation, and he felt something he did not expect. Not pity, not sympathy, but a flicker of sadness for a man who had been given so much and had used it to make others small. "We use the records," Marcus said finally, "but we don't leak them to the press. We use them in court. We let the law handle it. Calloway's going to answer for what he did, but we're going to do it the right way, not his way, our way." Gerald nodded slowly. "Your grandmother raised you well, Marcus." Patricia Odom looked at Marcus for a long moment, and something softened in her face. "You're not like him," she said. "I spent 3 years watching Calloway destroy people. You're building them up. Don't ever stop." The lawsuit moved forward. Gerald filed a countersuit on behalf of Marcus and Evelyn Grace, citing the employee theft evidence, the wage violations, and the hostile work environment that Calloway had fostered. The countersuit also included the body camera footage from Evelyn Grace's visit, footage that showed, in high definition and unmistakable clarity, every word Calloway had said, every expression on his face, every detail of his cruelty. The footage was submitted as evidence and placed under seal, but its existence was known, and the knowledge of it changed the dynamics of the case entirely. Calloway's lawyers, who had been aggressive and confident, became cautious and quiet. Motions slowed. Demands softened. Phone calls from William Drake became less frequent and less threatening. The tide was turning. 3 months after the confrontation in the dining room, on a gray morning in January, Marcus received a phone call from Gerald. "It's over," Gerald said. "Calloway's lawyers called this morning. They want to settle. Full withdrawal of the lawsuit, no damages, no admission of guilt on our side. In exchange, they want us to keep the employee theft records sealed and not pursue criminal charges." Marcus was sitting in his office at the restaurant, a cup of coffee steaming on his desk. Through the window, he could see Big Shirley in the kitchen, prepping for dinner, her large frame moving with the grace of a dancer. "What does Mrs. Grace say?" he asked. "Mrs. Grace says it's your decision," Gerald replied. "She says you've earned the right to make it." Marcus thought about it for a long time. He thought about the $400,000 that Calloway had stolen from people who worked harder than he ever did. He thought about Patricia Odom, who had risked everything to keep those records. He thought about the dishwashers and the bussers and the prep cooks who had been cheated out of their fair pay. And he thought about something Evelyn Grace had said to him in the hotel room on the morning that his life changed. A restaurant is not just a business, it's a home. A place where people are fed, in every sense of the word. Feeding people did not just mean food, it meant justice. It meant making wrong things right. "No deal," Marcus said into the phone. "We don't seal the records. We file them with the Department of Labor. Every employee who was cheated gets made whole. Every dollar that was stolen gets returned. And if the state decides to press charges, that's between Calloway and the law." Gerald was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'll make the call." Marcus hung up. He took a sip of his coffee. It was good coffee, rich and dark, made from beans that Big Shirley's nephew roasted in a small shop on the west side. For the first time in months, his hands were completely still. The fallout was swift and devastating. The Department of Labor opened an investigation into Calloway's management of La Maison d'Or. The investigation revealed that the employee theft totaled not $400,000, but $612,000, spanning nearly 8 years. Former employees were contacted and offered restitution. 16 of them filed individual complaints. The investigation expanded to include the other restaurants in the former chain, and similar patterns were found in 3 of them. Calloway's assets were frozen pending the outcome of the investigation. His membership at his country club was quietly suspended. His photograph, which had hung in the lobby of the Atlanta Chamber of Commerce, was removed without explanation. And the $47 million lawsuit was withdrawn, its absence from the docket as sudden and silent as a thief leaving through a window. Calloway himself was not seen in public for weeks. Then, one morning, Marcus received a letter. It was hand-delivered by a courier, sealed in a cream-colored envelope with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, handwritten in the careful, elegant script of a man who had been taught penmanship at an expensive school. It read, "Marcus, you took everything from me. The restaurant, my reputation, my future. I want you to know that I will never forgive you for this. But I also want you to know something that nobody else knows. Something about Evelyn Grace. Something that changes everything. If you want to know the truth, come to 4417 Habersham Road on Saturday at noon. Come alone. VC." Marcus read the letter 3 times. His first instinct was to throw it away, to dismiss it as the desperate gambit of a ruined man. But there was something in the tone of the letter, not the anger, not the bitterness, but the phrase, "something about Evelyn Grace," that snagged in his mind like a thorn. He called Gerald. Gerald's advice was unequivocal. "Don't go. It's a trap. Calloway is a wounded animal, and wounded animals are dangerous." Marcus called Evelyn Grace. She listened in silence, and then she said something that surprised him. "Go," she said. Her voice was quiet, almost fragile. "I think I know what he wants to tell you, and if I'm right, you deserve to hear it. Not from him. But if he's the only one willing to say it, then go." She paused. "But don't go alone. Take Big Shirley." Saturday came cold and bright, the January sun hanging low in a pale sky. Marcus drove to Habersham Road in a rental car, with Big Shirley in the passenger seat, her arms crossed over her chest like a bodyguard. The address was a house, not a mansion, but a modest Tudor-style home on a quiet, tree-lined street. The lawn was overgrown, the paint was peeling. A for-sale sign stood in the yard, tilted at an angle that suggested it had been there for a while. Marcus parked the car and sat for a moment, his hands on the steering wheel, his breath making small clouds in the cold air. "You sure about this?" Big Shirley asked. Marcus nodded. "Mrs. Grace told me to come." Big Shirley raised an eyebrow. Mrs. Grace also traveled the country dressed as a homeless woman for 3 years. The woman is not predictable. They walked up the path and knocked on the door. It opened almost immediately, as if Calloway had been standing behind it, waiting. He looked terrible. His silver hair was uncombed, his face unshaven, his suit replaced by a wrinkled sweater and khaki pants. He had lost weight, and his eyes, which had always been sharp and predatory, now looked hollow, the eyes of a man who had not slept in a very long time. He looked at Marcus. He looked at Big Shirley. He did not invite them in. Instead, he stepped outside, closed the door behind him, and sat on the porch step. Marcus and Big Shirley sat on the opposite side, a respectful distance away. For a long time, nobody spoke. A dog barked somewhere down the street. A bird sang from a bare branch. Then Calloway spoke, and his voice was stripped of all its former authority, thin and raw, like a wire scraped clean. "I'm not going to apologize," he said. "I don't know how, and I'm not sure I'm sorry. I'm angry. I'm humiliated. I lost everything. But that's not why I asked you here." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded photograph. It was old, creased, the colors faded. He held it out, and Marcus took it. The photograph showed a young woman standing in front of a small brick building on a city street. She was tall and strong-looking, with dark skin and bright eyes and a smile that could stop traffic. She wore a white apron and held a large metal pot. A handwritten sign above the building read, "La Maison d'Or, Grand Opening, 1978. And next to the woman, holding her hand, was a little boy. He was maybe 4 years old, with Calloway's jaw and Calloway's posture, standing straight-backed and proud. Marcus stared at the photograph. He looked at the woman. He looked at the little boy. He looked at Calloway. And slowly, like dawn breaking over a dark horizon, the pieces fell into place. "That's Evelyn Grace," Marcus said. "And that's you." Calloway nodded. His jaw was working, the muscles clenching and unclenching, the face of a man fighting a battle against his own emotions. "She's my mother," Calloway said. "She gave me up when I was 6, put me in the foster system. I spent 12 years in foster homes, group homes, juvenile facilities. I aged out at 18 with nothing. I changed my name. I built my own life. And when Sterling Hospitality sold the Atlanta restaurant, I bought it because I wanted to own the thing she loved more than me." Big Shirley's hand rose to her mouth. Marcus sat motionless, the photograph trembling in his fingers. The morning sun caught the image, illuminating the face of the young Evelyn Grace, her smile radiant, her eyes shining with the same fierce light that Marcus had seen in the alley, in the hotel room, in every encounter he had had with her. She had been a mother, she had had a son, and she had given him up. And he had come back, not as a son, but as a conqueror. Not to reclaim her love, but to claim her legacy. And in doing so, he had become the very thing she feared most, a man who valued profit over people, power over kindness, wealth over warmth. "Does she know?" Marcus asked. His voice came out in a whisper. "That you're her son?" Calloway laughed, a sound with no humor in it, a sound like breaking glass. "Of course she knows. She's known since I bought the restaurant. She reached out to me once, 2 years after the sale. A letter. I burned it without reading it. I didn't want her apology. I didn't want her explanation. I wanted her to see what I had become and know that I did it without her." His voice cracked on the last word, and he looked away, toward the overgrown lawn, the tilted for sale sign, the empty street. "And now here I am. No restaurant, no money, no reputation. And the only thing I have left is a photograph and the knowledge that my mother chose a pot of soup over her own son." Marcus sat on that porch step for a long time after Calloway finished speaking. Big Shirley was crying, silently, the tears rolling down her broad cheeks and dripping onto her coat. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. Marcus looked at the photograph again. The little boy holding his mother's hand, the pride in his eyes, the trust. And he thought about the Grace pot, the pot of soup that Evelyn Grace had kept by the back door for anyone who was hungry. The pot that she had built her entire legacy on. And he wondered what it had cost her. Not the soup, not the money, but the time. The hours and the days and the years she had poured into her restaurants instead of into the boy who needed her. He wondered if she had lain awake at night, as he sometimes did, staring at the ceiling, running the math of her choices, adding up the gains and subtracting the losses and coming up empty. "Why did you tell me this?" Marcus asked. Calloway met his eyes. For the first time, the contempt and the arrogance were gone, replaced by something raw and unfinished, the face of a child who had been left behind. "Because you remind me of who I was before I became this," Calloway said. "Before I let the anger eat everything good in me. You had nothing. You got fired for being kind. And you didn't let it make you cruel. I got fired from my own mother's life, and I let it turn me into a monster." He paused. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking you to do something I never could. Talk to her. Ask her why. And then decide for yourself whether she deserves to be running anything." Marcus stood up. He put the photograph in his pocket. He looked at Calloway, sitting on his crumbling porch in his wrinkled sweater. And he said something that surprised even himself. "I'm sorry for what you went through, Mr. Calloway. No child should be given up, and no child should have to spend their life trying to punish their mother for it." He paused. "But whatever happened between you and Mrs. Grace, she built something worth protecting. And so did you, even if you forgot what it was. The man who bought that restaurant did it because he loved his mother, even if he wouldn't admit it. That man is still in there somewhere." Calloway said nothing. He stared at the ground. Big Shirley stood up, wiped her eyes, and placed her hand on Calloway's shoulder for a brief moment. Then they walked back to the car and drove away. The drive back to the city was silent. Big Shirley stared out the window, her face still wet. Marcus drove with both hands on the wheel, his mind turning over what he had learned. Evelyn Grace had a son she had given up, a son who had grown up angry and alone, and had channeled that anger into acquiring the one thing his mother loved most, her restaurant. It was not a business story, it was a family story, a story of love and abandonment and the terrible things people do when they are in pain. And Marcus was standing in the middle of it, holding a photograph and a set of keys, and a weight that felt heavier than any tray he had ever carried. He went to see Evelyn Grace that evening. She was staying at the Georgian Terrace, the same suite where she had offered him the job. When she opened the door, she looked smaller than he remembered, as if Calloway's revelation had physically diminished her. She was wearing a simple white blouse and gray pants, and her reading glasses were perched on her head. She saw the photograph in Marcus's hand, and her face crumpled. Not dramatically, not with a sob or a cry. It crumpled slowly, like a paper lantern collapsing inward, the structure giving way to something soft and defeated. She stepped aside and let him in. They sat at the table by the window. The Atlanta skyline glittered in the darkness like a circuit board. The photograph lay between them. Neither of them touched it. His name was Vincent Grace, Evelyn said. Her voice was steady, but each word seemed to cost her something. I named him after my father. He was the most beautiful baby, fat cheeks, big eyes, a laugh that could fill a room. She paused. And I gave him up when he was 6 years old because I was 23, broke, working 3 jobs, and the restaurant was failing. The state came twice. They said the apartment was unfit. They said I was neglecting him. I wasn't. I loved him more than breathing. But I was never there. I was always at the restaurant, cooking, serving, cleaning, trying to build something that would give him a better life. And the state said that building something someday was not the same as being there today. Her hands were folded in her lap, the fingers interlocked so tightly that her knuckles had turned gray. I fought it. For 2 years, I fought it. And I lost. They placed him in foster care, and then they terminated my parental rights. I was 28 years old. And the restaurant opened its doors 6 months later. She looked at the photograph. I kept a pot of soup by the back door every night for the rest of my career. Not just for the hungry, for him. In case he ever came looking for me. In case he was hungry and had nowhere to go. I wanted there to always be something warm waiting for him. He never came. Not as a boy. He came as a man, with a new name and enough money to buy my restaurant. And enough anger to burn it down. Marcus listened. He did not interrupt. He did not judge. He let the words fill the room and settle into the silence. When Evelyn finished, she was not crying. She was past crying. She sat with the stillness of a woman who had carried this weight for so long that it had become part of her skeleton, inseparable from her bones. "Why didn't you tell me?" Marcus asked gently. Evelyn looked at him. "Because I was ashamed. Because I was afraid you would look at me the way the state looked at me. Like a woman who chose her restaurant over her child. Like a woman who doesn't deserve to be anyone's mother." She paused. "And because I was afraid it would change what you're building. La Maison d'Or is supposed to be about kindness and warmth and feeding people. How does it look when the founder couldn't even feed her own son?" Marcus reached across the table and took her hand. It was small and warm and trembling. "Mrs. Grace," he said, "you didn't choose the restaurant over your son. The state took him from you. That's not the same thing. And the pot of soup you kept by the back door every night for 50 years, that wasn't just for strangers. That was a mother leaving the light on for her child. Every single night." Evelyn's eyes filled. A single tear ran down her cheek, following the deep line beside her mouth. She did not wipe it away. "Do you think he'll ever forgive me?" she whispered. Marcus thought about Calloway on his porch, the photograph in his hand, the crack in his voice when he said, "She chose a pot of soup over her own son." And he thought about what he had seen in Calloway's eyes in that moment. Not hatred, not contempt, but the same thing he saw in Evelyn's eyes right now. Loss. The aching, bottomless loss of a family that was never whole. "I don't know," Marcus said honestly, "but I think you need to try. Not with a letter this time, face to face, mother to son. And if he slams the door, you go back the next day, and the next. Because that's what the pot of soup was for, showing up, every single day, even when nobody comes." 3 weeks later, on a cold February morning, Evelyn Grace drove to 4417 Habersham Road. Marcus offered to go with her, but she shook her head. "This is something I have to do alone," she said. "Some doors you have to walk through by yourself." She was gone for 4 hours. When she returned, her eyes were red and swollen, but her face held something Marcus had never seen on it before. Peace. Not happiness, not resolution, but the fragile, tentative piece of a woman who has finally said the words she has been holding for 50 years. "He listened," she told Marcus. "He didn't forgive me. He didn't say he loved me, but he listened. For the first time in his life, he listened." She paused. "I told him about the soup, about the pot by the back door, about how every night for 50 years I ladled that soup and looked at the door and prayed that the next person who walked through it would be him." Her voice caught. "He cried, Marcus. My boy cried. And when a man who hasn't cried in 50 years finally breaks, that's not weakness. That's the dam coming down. That's the river finding its way home." The months that followed brought changes that Marcus could not have predicted. The lawsuit was settled. Calloway received no money, but he received something that mattered more: a seat at the table. Not literally, but figuratively. Evelyn Grace, with Gerald Thompson's help, created a new position at La Maison d'Or. It was called the Grace Fellowship, a paid mentorship program for people who had aged out of the foster care system, offering job training, life skills, housing assistance, and a clear pathway to careers in the hospitality industry. And the first director of the Grace Fellowship was Vincent Calloway. Not because he was qualified, not because he deserved it, but because Evelyn Grace believed that the best way to heal a wound was not to hide it, but to let it breathe. And the best way to redeem a broken man was to give him something worth building. Calloway did not transform overnight. He was stiff and awkward with the fellows, uncomfortable with vulnerability, prone to retreating into the cold professionalism that had been his armor for decades. But slowly, day by day, week by week, something shifted. The fellows, young people who had grown up in the same system that had shaped him, recognized something in his eyes. They recognized the anger, the loneliness, the desperate need to prove that they were worth something. And they trusted him because he did not pretend to be whole. He told them the truth. "I spent my whole life running from where I came from," he said one afternoon, standing before a group of 12 fellows in the restaurant's private dining room. "And all that running brought me right back to the same place, broke, alone, and sitting on a porch step with nothing but a photograph. Don't make my mistake. Don't let the anger run you. You run it. You use it. You build with it. And then, when you're tired of being angry, you set it down. And you pick up something better." Spring came to Atlanta like a promise being kept. The dogwoods bloomed along Peachtree Street, their white flowers bright against the new green leaves. La Maison d'Or was thriving. Revenue was up 40% from the previous year. The reservation list stretched 8 months. The Grace Fellowship had graduated its first cohort of 12 fellows, 11 of whom were employed in the hospitality industry. Big Shirley's Catfish had been featured in 4 national publications. Grace Okafor had won a regional sommelier competition, and Marcus Tate, the busboy who had given his dinner to a homeless woman, had been named one of Atlanta's 30 under 30 by the city's most prestigious business magazine. On a warm evening in April, Marcus stood in the back alley of the restaurant. It was the same alley where he had found Evelyn Grace on that cold October night. The dumpster was still there, and the back door, and the brick walls. But next to the door, where there had once been nothing but wet cardboard and garbage, there was now a small wooden table with a white tablecloth, 2 chairs, and a large ceramic pot painted with golden letters that read, "The Grace Pot." Every evening, at 7 o'clock, Marcus or one of the fellows filled that pot with soup, thick, rich, nourishing soup made from Big Shirley's recipe, and set it on the table with a stack of clean bowls and a handwritten sign that said, "Take what you need. You are welcome here." Marcus stood by the pot and looked up at the sky. The stars were invisible behind the city lights, but he knew they were there. He pulled his notebook from his back pocket, the same notebook he had carried as a busboy, the same notebook that Evelyn Grace had told him to keep. He opened it to the first page, where, months ago, on a wet night in this very alley, he had written 3 words, "She saw me." He turned to the last page with writing on it, the page he had written that morning, and read it again. "The pot is full. The door is open. The light is on." He closed the notebook and slipped it back into his pocket. Behind him, the back door opened, and Evelyn Grace stepped out. She was not disguised tonight. She wore a simple dress and a cardigan, and her white hair caught the light from the kitchen. Beside her was Calloway. He was wearing an apron, the first time Marcus had ever seen him in one. They stood on either side of the grace pot, mother and son, separated by 50 years of pain, connected by something that was older than pain and stronger than anger. Calloway ladled soup into a bowl and handed it to a man who had walked up from the street, a thin man in a worn jacket with eyes that held the same hunger that Evelyn's had held on the night Marcus found her. "Here you go, brother," Calloway said, and his voice was rough and unpracticed but genuine. "It's good soup, made by a good woman." Evelyn Grace reached over and squeezed her son's hand. He did not pull away. Marcus watched them for a moment, and then he walked back inside. The dining room was full. The candles flickered. The laughter and conversation swelled like music. Big Shirley was singing in the kitchen, a low, rolling gospel song that vibrated through the walls. Grace Okafor was pouring wine with the precision and joy of someone who loved her work. The fellows were clearing tables, setting places, greeting guests, their young faces bright with purpose. And Marcus moved through it all, touching a shoulder here, adjusting a napkin there, pausing at a table to ask how the meal was, to laugh at a joke, to shake a hand. He was no longer the background, he was the heart. He stopped at the front window and looked out at Peachtree Street. The dogwoods were blooming. The evening light was golden. A family walked past, 2 parents and a little girl who was eating an ice cream cone and laughing. Marcus watched them, and he felt something settle inside him. Not excitement, not triumph, but a deep, quiet peace that seemed to radiate from his center like warmth from a fire. He reached into his pocket and touched the notebook. He thought about Nana Ruth and her words at the kitchen table. He thought about the photograph of a young mother and her little boy in front of a brick building in 1978. He thought about a pot of soup and an open door and a light left on for 50 years. Outside, the evening deepened. Inside, the restaurant hummed with life. And from the back alley, the smell of good soup drifted through the open door, out into the Atlanta night, carried on the warm spring air like a prayer, like a promise, like a hand reaching out in the darkness, waiting to be held. Marcus smiled. He straightened his tie. He walked back to the dining room. The grace pot was full. The door was open and the light was on. And for the first time in his whole life, it was on for him too. Thank you for staying until the end. If you enjoyed the story, please support the channel with a like. Take care.